This is the reason Nazi Germany lost the Second World War, and it is not the reason almost every documentary gives you. This is the story of an economy that was beaten by steel, coal, oil, machine tools and railway timetables years before the first shot was fired at Stalingrad. In 1944, under the heaviest aerial bombardment in human history, German war production climbed to the highest point of the entire war. 39,807 aircraft rolled out of German factories that year, more than in 1943, more than in 1942, more than in any year since the Nazi state began rearming. Bombers came in daylight, bombers came at night, and German output went up anyway. 9 months later the Reich no longer existed. That single fact breaks the story most people have been told, because a country outproducing itself right up to the collapse did not collapse from a shortage of factories. Something else killed it, and the factories could not fix that something. Adam Tooze compressed the argument into one line in his 2006 study, Wages of Destruction, where he located the roots of the Second World War in Germany's weakness rather than in Germany's strength. That line is the thesis of this episode. Germany did not lose because Hitler turned left toward Kiev instead of driving on Moscow, and Germany did not lose to one cold winter. Germany lost because a country holding no oil, no rubber, no domestic iron or worth the name and an army that moved on horses picked a fight with roughly 3/4 of the industrial capacity of the planet. Start with the number that decides everything. Mark Harrison, in The Economics of World War II, published by Cambridge University Press in 1998, calculated the pre-war gross domestic product of the great power coalitions as they actually stood in 1942, and the Allied powers exceeded the Axis powers by a ratio of 2.4 to 1. That ratio narrowed briefly to roughly 2 to 1 during 1941, because the Axis economies were still swelling through conquest. From 1942 onward it moved steadily the other way, and by 1944 it had widened to 3.3 to 1. 3.3 to 1. That is the war. Harrison attaches one qualification that this episode keeps returning to, which is that only on the Eastern Front did the Allies not hold that advantage. Man for man and factory for factory, the Soviet Union on its own was not richer than Nazi Germany, it was poorer, and that is why the Eastern Front produced the killing it produced. The economic argument is not a simple story of rich beating poor. Translate those ratios into physical objects and the picture sharpens. Across the whole war the United States built 354,750 aircraft, the Soviet Union built 157,261, and the United Kingdom built 131,549. Germany managed 119,371, while Japan managed 76,320. Add the three main Allied powers together and the figure passes 640,000 aircraft against an Axis total under 200,000. Now run the same comparison at the beginning, because the beginning looked nothing like the end. In 1939 the United States turned out 2,141 aircraft, while German factories turned out 8,295. On the eve of the war Germany was building nearly 4 times as many aircraft as the United States of America. That gap is the trap Nazi Germany walked into. The German lead in 1939 was real, and 5 years later the United States alone was building 96,318 aircraft a year, which made the German figure of 39,807, the highest in German history. Less than half of one country's output. Germany never slowed down. Germany simply got outscaled by economies that had barely started. Here is where the popular story and the archival record part company. Popular history treats the Third Reich as an industrial titan that overreached, and Adam Tooze argues something close to the reverse. Germany, in Tooze's account, was never as wealthy as Britain or the United States, and it stayed dependent on foreign trade, lurching from foreign exchange crisis to raw material shortage and back again. That precariousness, rather than confidence, set the clock, and the Nazi leadership convinced itself that war had to come quickly, before Germany fell hopelessly behind. Look at what Germany actually held and what Germany actually lacked. Coal came in enormous quantity, with German output reaching roughly 443.9 million metric tons in 1943, which made Germany the largest coal and steel producer in Europe by a wide margin. Oil did not come at all. Neither did rubber, and neither did iron or in useful grades. Throughout the entire war the ore-feeding German steel arrived largely from neutral Sweden, which meant the German war economy ran along a shipping route that a hostile navy could theoretically cut. The Nazi answer to that vulnerability carried a name and a date. During August of 1936, Hitler personally drafted a confidential memorandum demanding maximum self-sufficiency in fuel and raw materials, and setting a deadline of 4 years for the German armed forces to become operational and the German economy to become war-capable. On the 18th of October, 1936, Hermann Göring took the post of plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan. That appointment doubled as a purge. Göring's new authority deliberately bypassed the economics minister, Hjalmar Schacht, the financier who had engineered German rearmament and who now objected to its pace, and Schacht found himself sidelined and resigned during November of 1937. Walther Funk replaced him, and Funk proved more compliant. Strip the swastikas off the 4-year plan and what remains is a policy problem governments are still arguing about right now, which goes by the name resource nationalism. A state examines its import dependence, decides that dependence is a strategic liability, and spends enormous sums building domestic substitutes that cost more and work worse than simply buying on the world market. The 4-year plan stands as the largest and most catastrophic experiment ever run on that idea, because Nazi Germany spent a decade and a fortune trying to buy its way out of geology, and the geology won. Those synthetic substitutes were real engineering achievements. IG Farben produced synthetic fuel through the Bergius process and synthetic rubber under the name Buna, and in 1937 the Reichswerk Hermann Göring was founded specifically to process low-grade domestic iron ore that private German industry had already dismissed as uneconomic to smelt. Read that last sentence again, because it carries more weight than it first appears to. The Nazi state built an entire industrial combine to mine ore that businessmen had calculated was not worth mining, and that is not the behavior of an economy with options. That is the behavior of an economy trying to escape its own arithmetic. Behind that arithmetic sat the coalition problem. Whatever Germany built, Germany would eventually face the combined output of the United States, the Soviet Union and the British Empire at the same time. Before going deeper into the economics, the image needs dismantling. That image is the Panzer Column, the motorized blitzkrieg, mechanized and modern, rolling across Poland and France and Russia on rubber and diesel. The image was manufactured, because German photographers received direction toward the tanks and away from whatever was actually moving the German army. What actually moved the German army was horses. For Operation Barbarossa, launched on the 22nd of June, 1941, the Wehrmacht committed up to 750,000 horses and mules, and the order of battle for that month lists roughly 600,000 horses alongside roughly 600,000 motor vehicles. Horses supplied approximately 80% of the German army's motive power and pulled about 2/3 of its vehicles, which left only around 20% of the army mechanized in any meaningful sense. More than 1 million horses remained in German service near the end of the war. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt admitted it in plain terms, conceding that the army which invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 leaned on divisions that moved on foot or behind horse-drawn wagons. The 20% that was mechanized carried a second problem, and this one owes nothing to ideology and everything to manufacturing discipline. Germany could not standardize. The pre-war Einheits PKW program, an attempt to impose a single standard chassis across German military vehicles, failed outright, and what the Wehrmacht fielded instead was a sprawl of incompatible vehicle types. A sprawl of incompatible types means a sprawl of incompatible spare parts, which meant that a workshop in Ukraine holding the correct gearbox for one truck was holding the wrong gearbox for the truck parked beside it. Cross the domain and the failure gets a modern name. Manufacturing calls it part commonality, and it underpins modular production, lean manufacturing and every platform strategy in the automotive industry. Building one chassis 1,000,000 times is cheap, while building 40 chassis 25,000 times each ruins you, not because the engineering grows harder, but because every extra variant multiplies the tooling, the training, the inventory and the failure modes. The Soviet Union arrived at that lesson through poverty. Germany never arrived at it at all. The same failure shows up on German railways, where the Deutsche Reichsbahn operated dozens of locomotive classes. Only under wartime pressure did Germany finally mass-produce a single standardized war locomotive, the Class 52 Kriegslokomotive, and more than 10,000 of those were built. German industry could do this when it was finally forced to build one thing instead of 40, and the forcing took until the war had already turned. Now the puzzle that decides the whole argument, carried by the single most useful number in this episode. By 1942, the German-controlled economic sphere in Europe produced roughly 7.2 times more coal than the truncated Soviet Union, and roughly 9.7 times more coke. The German invasion had torn the Soviet industrial heartland away, and Soviet coal output collapsed from 139.9 million tons in 1940 to 49 million tons in 1942, a loss of nearly two-thirds in 2 years. Germany held the coal, the coke, the steel, the machine tools, the trained engineers, the chemical industry, and a century of industrial tradition. And the Soviet Union still outbuilt Germany in tanks by roughly 2-1 across the war, and by roughly 6-1 in the opening period. The T-34 alone reached somewhere between 57,300 and 57,339 units by the end of 1945. Total Soviet fully tracked armored vehicle production from June of 1941 to May of 1945, on the figures compiled by Krivoshev, reached 99,150 vehicles. German tank production across the war usually lands somewhere between 20,000 and 26,900, and that range exists because sources disagree about whether assault guns belong in the count. Presented honestly, 20,000 at the low end, 26,900 at the high end, against 99,150. This is where the standard explanation collapses, because the standard explanation says Germany lost quality against quantity, that German tanks ran better and Soviet tanks simply came in greater numbers. That framing quietly concedes the entire argument, since it assumes German production was already doing everything it could. German production was not doing everything it could. Germany held the larger industrial base and lost the production war regardless, and the literature on the T-34 states the comparison directly, placing German industrial resources at close to double those of the Soviet Union. So the failure never lived in capacity. The failure lived in allocation and design discipline, because the Soviet Union concentrated on a narrow band of standardized designs and simplified them relentlessly for mass output, while Germany scattered its effort across competing programs, competing agencies, and competing designs, and then complained about the results. And the Soviet Union pulled this off after losing its coal. During 1941, Soviet industry was physically evacuated eastward beyond the Urals and rebuilt at sites like Chelyabinsk, which acquired the nickname Tankograd. Factories came apart, went onto trains, traveled 1,000 miles and started again. Soviet coal still sat at 49 million tons in 1942 and recovered only to 99.4 million by 1945, never regaining the 1940 level, and that shattered, relocated, under-resourced industrial system still buried German armored production. The winter of 1941 into 1942 does belong in this story, though not in the way it usually gets told. Most tellings run meteorological, with general winter, frozen Germans, and the cold that stopped the Wehrmacht. What actually mattered economically unfolded several hundred miles behind the front line, inside the German railway system. That winter the Deutsche Reichsbahn suffered a coal and transport crisis, and on the figures cited by David Stadl, roughly 2,500 locomotives and 200,000 railway cars had already been diverted east to feed the invasion. Pull that much rolling stock out of a national rail network and the network loses the ability to move the one commodity Germany owned in abundance, which is coal. Coal that cannot move is not a resource, it is a rock sitting in a hole in the ground. That crisis came close to a genuine collapse, and it became one of the direct triggers for the reorganization that produced the most famous name in German war production. On the 8th of February, 1942, Fritz Todt, Reich Minister for Armaments and Munitions, died in an air crash, and Albert Speer took the ministry that same day. 6 weeks later, on the 21st of March, 1942, Fritz Sauckel became plenipotentiary general for labor. Those two appointments, 6 weeks apart in the spring of 1942, marked the moment the Nazi war economy is usually said to have transformed. Hold the thought, because what follows takes it apart. The central contrarian argument of this episode concerns a slideshow. Adam Tooze has described being haunted by one particular image, dated June of 1944, showing Albert Speer standing before an audience with a chart, and the chart displays the upward surge of the German armaments production index. Speer preaching the armaments miracle. The story that chart tells dominated post-war understanding for decades. Nazi Germany, so the account runs, fought the first half of the war with a lazy, undermobilized economy, and then in February of 1942 a brilliant young technocrat named Albert Speer took over armaments, swept away the incompetence, imposed rationalization, and produced a miracle. German output tripled, the graph climbed, and the man holding the chart made it climb. Nearly every element of that account has now been dismantled. Begin with the chart itself, compiled by Speer's own chief statistician, Rolf Wagenfer. Scholarly examination of that index indicates it very likely. undercounted German output between 1938 and 1942 and overstated the gains that arrived afterward. Alan Millward raised the caution and Adam Tooze confirmed the problem, which makes the miracle partly a measurement artifact, because moving the baseline down makes the later surge look larger than it was. The timing does not work either. Jonas Sterner and Johann Streb examined the question directly in a study whose title asks whether this was the end of a myth, and their finding is that no clear discontinuity appears in German production or German industrial organization at the moment Speer arrived. Fixed price contracts that rewarded efficiency, and rationalization measures that raised throughput, all predated Albert Speer's appointment. Speer inherited a machine already accelerating and then collected the credit for the acceleration. Then comes the finding that reframes the entire question, which is that the gains were structural rather than managerial. Richard Overy and Adam Tooze both argue that the post-1942 surge reflected two things. One was the maturing of enormous heavy industrial investment made from 1936 onward under the four-year plan, because a blast furnace ordered in 1938 does not pour steel in 1938, it pours steel in 1942. The second was the learning curve. The learning curve carries a modern name. Manufacturing economics calls it Reich's law, and it stands as one of the most reliable regularities in the field, holding that unit cost falls by a predictable percentage every time cumulative production doubles. Reich's law explains why solar panels and lithium cells and semiconductors got cheap, and it is not a management technique. It describes what happens automatically when a workforce builds the same object over and over and gradually stops making mistakes. Every hour a German factory spent building Messerschmitts made the next Messerschmitt slightly cheaper and slightly faster to build. That process was already running before Albert Speer took office, and it kept running afterward, and it was going to draw a rising output curve regardless of who held the ministry. Speer arrived at exactly the right moment to stand in front of it holding a pointer. The reputation survived because Albert Speer built it deliberately. Magnus Bretschken's 2017 study, Albert Speer, A German Career, drew on extensive archival material to demolish Speer's post-war self-portrait as the good Nazi, the apolitical technician who knew nothing, and Bretschken's Speer emerges as a knowing perpetrator who worked prisoners to death. Gitta Serini reached related conclusions, and Adam Tooze supplied the economic demolition in Wages of Destruction. So treat every claim tracing back to Speer's own memoirs, including one that appears later in this episode, as evidence about Speer rather than evidence about Germany. That includes the miracle. No miracle occurred. What occurred was a heavy industrial program built in the late 1930s finally coming online, a workforce descending a learning curve, and a minister with a chart. One factor in the German production surge was genuinely new after 1942, and it was not a management innovation. It was slavery. Fritz Sauckel took the post of Plenipotentiary General for Labor on the 21st of March, 1942, and Sauckel became responsible for moving roughly 5 million foreign forced laborers into the German war economy. Sauckel characterized his own program on the 1st of March, 1944, in a statement later entered at Nuremberg, where he stated that out of 5 million foreign workers who arrived in Germany, not even 200,000 came voluntarily. Sauckel disputed that characterization at his trial, and the tribunal found it broadly accurate. The scale climbed from there. By the middle of 1944, the German war economy employed between 7.5 and 7.6 million foreign civilian workers and prisoners of war, amounting to approximately 21% of the civilian workforce. Wider estimates of total forced labor across the war run between 9.5 and 10 million people, alongside approximately 2.5 million concentration camp prisoners exploited between 1939 and 1945. The largest national groups numbered approximately 2.8 million people from the Soviet Union and approximately 1.7 million from Poland. The Nuremberg document catalogued as PS 2520, a tabulation associated with Speer and Sauckel, records 4,795,000 foreign workers, 1,873,000 prisoners of war, and 23,200 political prisoners, giving a combined total of 6,691,000. Erhard Milch, addressing the Central Planning Body on the 16th of February, 1944, put it in percentage terms, telling that meeting that the German armaments industry employed foreign workers to a large extent and that the latest figures placed the share at 40%. As of the 11th of February, 1944, approximately 2 million foreign civilian workers were employed in armaments and munitions manufacture specifically. Take one location. Mittelbau-Dora, in the Harz Mountains, where V-2 rocket production went underground during August of 1943. Approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through Mittelbau-Dora, and an estimated 20,000 of them died. Roughly 9,000 died of exhaustion and collapse, approximately 350 were hanged, around 200 of those for sabotage, and the remainder died of disease and starvation. Approximately 1 prisoner in 3 did not survive that camp. Approximately 6,000 V-2 rockets were built between August of 1943 and April of 1945, and those rockets killed approximately 5,000 people. At least 10 to 20,000 people died building them. More human beings died manufacturing the V-2 than died underneath it. That is not a moral flourish laid on top of the arithmetic, that is the arithmetic. The camp became an autonomous administrative unit, designated KL Mittelbau, on the 28th of October, 1944, controlling around 40 subcamps, and liberation came on the 11th of April, 1945. The same system underpinned Krupp, IG Farben at Monowitz, where the Buna synthetic rubber plants stood, Henschel, Maybach and Volkswagen. Here is the point that connects slavery back to the production graph. The Nazi state solved its labor shortage by importing people at gunpoint and working them to death, which raises output briefly while destroying the workforce that produces it. That method also guaranteed that a large share of the German war economy was staffed by people carrying every possible incentive to build the machine badly, and 200 prisoners were hanged at Mittelbau-Dora for sabotage, which tells you sabotage was happening. A broader argument sits underneath this, and some historians place it at the center of the whole question. In that reading, Nazi ideology was never a moral disfigurement bolted onto an otherwise rational war economy, because Nazi ideology was itself the fatal economic constraint. It destroyed the labor supply it depended on, and it alienated the populations of the occupied East who might, under any other occupying power, have been recruited against the Soviet state. Adam Tooze folds this directly into the economics, noting that starving and enslaving people classified as lesser was, in Nazi logic, an economic policy, and a self-defeating one. A second explanation turns up in almost every treatment of the German war economy, and the evidence behind it is considerably weaker than its popularity suggests. The claim holds that Germany lost through a refusal to mobilize its women. Nazi ideology, that argument runs, chained German women to the household while British and Soviet women filled the factories, and the ideological squeamishness cost Germany the war. Richard Overy tested the claim against the labor statistics, and the statistics refused to support it. By 1939, just over half of all women in Germany between the ages of 15 and 60 already held jobs, while the comparable British figure sat at only about a quarter. Women's share of the German labor force also exceeded the equivalent share in the United States, which stood at 26%. Read those numbers in the correct direction. On the eve of the war, German female labor participation ran roughly double the British rate, which means the country supposedly holding its women out of the workforce had already put more of them into it than the countries it was fighting. Adam Tooze pushes further and rejects the idea that Germany could have mobilized meaningfully more women than it did, because the reserve the argument assumes was sitting idle had, to a large extent, already gone to work. Where did the myth come from? It grew out of 2 visible facts that pointed the wrong way. Since Germany never introduced female conscription, and Joseph Goebbels issued a public appeal for female labor during 1943, which historians reasonably read as an admission of shortfall. Absence of a conscription law and presence of a propaganda appeal got taken as evidence of an untapped reserve, and the employment data indicates that reserve was largely a fiction. This matters beyond the specific question, because it demonstrates the pattern running through the entire subject. The explanations that survived were the explanations that were visible and rhetorically satisfying, while the explanations that decided the war stayed buried in freight tonnage and coal allocation tables that nobody films. Everything so far has been structural. What follows is where the structure meets a bomb. Germany held no oil, so Germany manufactured oil instead, using the Bergius process in Fischer-Tropsch synthesis to convert coal into liquid fuel. According to the United States Department of Energy, over 92% of Germany's aviation gasoline and roughly half of Germany's total petroleum came out of those synthetic plants. Sit with that figure. 92% of the fuel that flew the Luftwaffe never came out of the ground, it came out of chemical reactors. Peak synthetic fuel output, reached in early 1944, ran to approximately 124,000 barrels per day, produced by 25 plants, and that number of plants is the entire story. 25 buildings standing between the Luftwaffe and the ground. Unlike an army, a chemical plant cannot retreat, cannot disperse, cannot hide and cannot be rebuilt quickly, because a hydrogenation plant is a forest of high-pressure vessels and precision pipework that takes years to erect. Modern supply chain analysis has a term for exactly this condition, calling it a single point of failure, and identifying them is now a formal discipline inside every serious manufacturing organization. The question runs simply: if this one node stops, what fraction of the system stops with it? And when the answer approaches 100%, the node is not an asset. The node is a liability wearing the costume of an asset. Contemporary examples come easily, with advanced semiconductor fabrication concentrated into a handful of facilities and rare earth processing concentrated into a handful of refineries. The entire modern conversation about supply chain resilience amounts to a conversation about not building what Nazi Germany built. Germany had concentrated the fuel supply of a continental war machine into 25 addresses, and the combined bomber offensive found the addresses. The oil campaign opened in earnest during May of 1944, and what followed ranks among the steepest industrial collapses ever recorded. Monthly synthetic fuel output, on figures compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, peaked at approximately 316,000 tons per month. By June of 1944 it stood at 107,000 tons, and by September of 1944 it stood at 17,000 tons. Aviation fuel specifically fell harder. April of 1944 delivered between 175,000 and 181,000 tons, July delivered 30,000 tons, and September delivered 5,000 tons. That is a fall of roughly 97% in 5 months. The Luna plant alone absorbed 22 bombing raids, and its capacity dropped by more than 90%. The crude oil side went the same way. Ploiești, in Romania, supplied the largest natural oil source available to the Reich, and Operation Tidal Wave struck it on 1 August 1943, with 177 B-24 bombers, at a cost of over 50 aircraft lost. Romanian oil deliveries to Germany finally stopped during September of 1944, not through bombing, but because the Soviet advance took the ground. Then comes the consequence, and it is the image this entire episode has been building toward. During March of 1945, advancing Soviet forces overran 1,200 German tanks that had run out of fuel. Not destroyed, not knocked out, not beaten in battle. 1,200 tanks, complete, armored, gunned and crewed, sitting still because nothing remained to put in them. The armaments miracle built those tanks. The armaments miracle could not build a liter of petrol, and that gap is the difference between production and war. While the fuel problem developed on land, an arithmetic of the same shape ran at sea, and it delivered the same verdict faster. The German submarine campaign amounted, at its core, to a mathematical bet. Sink Allied merchant ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them, and the British Isles starve, the invasion of Europe never assembles, and the Soviet Union receives nothing. Germany built approximately 1,150 U-boats, and cumulative Allied shipping losses across the war reached approximately 14 million tons. In purely destructive terms, the campaign worked. None of that mattered. During 1943 alone, the United States launched 1,121 Liberty ships. Across the war, 2,710 Liberty ships were built, delivering over 29 million deadweight tons, and the American merchant fleet swelled to approximately 50 million deadweight tons by the end. 14 million tons sunk over 6 years, against 29 million tons delivered by one standardized program. Look at what the Liberty ship actually was, because it inverts German industrial practice at every point. One design, deliberately unlovely, welded instead of riveted, prefabricated in sections, assembled by workers who in many cases had never built a ship before, and produced in numbers large enough that the learning curve handled the rest. Wright's law in steel. Germany fielded the better engineers, while the United States made the better decision, which was to pick one thing and build it 10,000 times. From the middle of 1942 onward, Allied new construction outpaced Allied sinkings, and that crossover marks the real end of the Battle of the Atlantic, arriving before the tactical defeat of the U-boat arm. That tactical defeat landed in May of 1943, remembered as Black May, when 43 U-boats went down in a single month, approximately 25% of operational strength. The Soviet Union outproduced Germany in tanks, but the Soviet Union did not outproduce Germany in everything, and the gaps got filled from Detroit. Between November of 1941 and September of 1945, Lend-Lease delivered to the Soviet Union between 375,883 and over 400,000 trucks, the most famous of them built by Studebaker. On figures cited by Max Hastings in Inferno, Of the roughly 665,000 vehicles in Red Army service by 1945, approximately 427,000 had been built in America. The Soviet Union also received between 15,000 and 22,150 aircraft, plus approximately 12,000 to 12,700 tanks and armored vehicles. The railway numbers are the ones that decide campaigns. Lend-Lease supplied between 1,900 and 1,981 locomotives, while Soviet wartime locomotive production came to approximately 92. Lend-Lease also supplied 11,075 railway cars, and approximately 56.6% of all the rails used. More than half the rail the Soviet Union laid during the Great Patriotic War arrived by ship. Then the consumables. Aviation fuel came to 628,400 tons, approximately 57.8% of Soviet requirements. Explosives came to 345,735 tons, approximately 53%. Food came to approximately 4.5 million tons. The Soviet public position placed Lend-Lease at roughly 4% of Soviet output, and Georgy Zhukov said so publicly. In a conversation recorded during 1963, corroborated by the writer Konstantin Simonov, Zhukov said something very different, stating that the Americans gave so much material that without it the Soviet Union could not have formed its reserves and could not have continued the war. Then came the detail carrying the most weight, which was that the Soviet Union had no explosives and no powder. Anastas Mikoyan compressed it into one sentence, observing that the Soviet army suddenly found itself on wheels, and what wheels? The distance between the public 4% and the private assessment is itself a historical document, telling you that the men running the Soviet war effort knew exactly what the trucks and the locomotives and the powder had done, and could not say so. The balanced conclusion runs like this. Lend-Lease did not stop the German advance in 1941, because most of it had not arrived yet. What Lend-Lease did was hand the Red Army strategic mobility from 1942 onward, since the Soviet Union built the tanks while the United States supplied the wheels underneath everything that followed the tanks, and the rails underneath the wheels. An offensive on the scale of Bagration is not a tank problem, it is a trucking problem. That is the coalition argument in physical form. The Allies pooled American industrial output, Soviet manpower, and British finance into one system, while the Axis conquered an entire continent and never managed to integrate it. Controlling resources and mobilizing resources are not the same act, and under Axis occupation the incomes of the occupied economies fell. Germany took Europe and made Europe poorer, which meant Germany had taken less than the map suggested. Return now to the fact that opened this episode, which is that German production peaked in 1944 under the heaviest bombing of the war. People often deploy that fact to argue the strategic bombing campaign failed. The argument is more interesting than that. Start with the tonnage. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the United States Army Air Forces expended 1,050,710 U.S. tons against Germany, while RAF Bomber Command expended 989,320 U.S. tons, giving a combined strategic total of approximately 2.04 million tons of bombs. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that the oil campaign and the transport campaign proved decisive in the late war period, and the fuel figures given earlier come from the survey's own evidence, which makes that conclusion hard to argue with. The survey also attracts criticism, and the criticism is methodological, holding that the surveys were structured in ways that tended to produce particular conclusions. That is a reasonable thing to say about any institutional self-assessment conducted by the organization whose performance is under assessment. Adam Tooze reconciles the two positions. Bombing, in Tooze's argument, capped German production, which means the 1944 peak is not evidence that bombing failed, it is evidence of where German output got held. The relevant comparison is not 1944 against 1943, it is 1944 against whatever 1944 would have produced without 2 million tons of high explosive, the dispersal of factories, the diversion of construction labor and the wrecking of transport. Richard Overy adds the argument that reframes the whole campaign, treating strategic bombing as a second front. Bombing pulled German fighter aircraft back from the Eastern Front to defend German cities, absorbed approximately 3 million personnel into air defense, construction, and repair, and turned the 88mm gun, the best anti-tank weapon Germany possessed, into an anti-aircraft gun pointed at the sky over the Ruhr instead of at Soviet armor on the steppe. Every 88 pointing up was an 88 not pointing east. A tactical figure shows the transport campaign biting, because during May of 1944 Allied fighter bombers were destroying approximately 40 German trains per day. 40 trains a day, inside an economy whose coal distribution had already nearly collapsed once during the winter of 1941. One more comparison closes this section, and it complicates the simple production story in a useful direction. Between January and June of 1944, Anglo-American fighter output totaled 11,817 aircraft, while German fighter output across the same 6 months totaled 9,489, and Richard Overy cites those figures in The Bombers and the Bombed. 11,800 against 9,500. That is not a 3-to-1 industrial disparity, that is close, and it shows the German aircraft industry at the point of maximum pressure very nearly matching the combined fighter production of Britain and the United States. Which returns the question to fuel and to pilots, and answers it. Germany was building the fighters and could not fuel the fighters, because the bottleneck never lived in the airframe. One question remains, and it is arguably the most important one in this episode. If the economic evidence runs this clear, and much of it was available immediately after the war, why does the popular account still center on Hitler's operational blunders, on the winter, and on the generals who could have won if only they had been left alone? The answer is that the popular account got written by the losing generals, and then published by the winning army. At Nuremberg, Franz Halder and other senior officers put their names to a memorandum titled The German Army 1920–1945. Halder went on to lead the United States Army Historical Division program, overseeing approximately 700 former German officers employed to write the operational history of the war they had just lost. Consider the structure of that arrangement. The men writing the authoritative account of German military operations were the men whose reputations, and in several cases whose freedom, depended on the content of that account. The narrative that emerged carried two components. First, the German army was a professional institution that fought a conventional war and stood clear of the crimes of the regime. Second, German defeat came from the interference of an amateur strategist in Berlin. Blame the leader, exonerate the army. Both have served the men doing the writing. Heinz Guderian's memoirs and Erich von Manstein's memoirs carried that framework to a mass readership, and it hardened into the operating assumption of English-language popular history for a generation. Wolfram Wett described the clean Wehrmacht thesis as a collective perjury. The public turning point inside Germany arrived in 1995 with the Hamburg Wehrmacht exhibition, which put documentary evidence of army participation in atrocity in front of a general audience. The mechanism becomes visible in miniature at Kursk, documented by Roman Toppel in his 2017 study, published in English in 2018. Toppel dismantles myths in both directions, which is what makes the case useful. On the Soviet side, the claim that Prokhorovka became a graveyard of German armor rests on grossly inflated loss figures tracing back to General Rotmistrov, who needed to justify catastrophic Soviet losses to Stalin. On the German side, Toppel takes apart the memoir tradition of blaming Hitler for the outcome. Both stories were written by men explaining themselves to a superior or to posterity, and neither survived contact with the archives. None of this is settled history being recited, because it stays live. Toppel's low German loss thesis draws corroboration from Ben Wheatley and from Sean McMeekin, and it draws challenge from Karsten Heinz Skonbach, who argues that German loss reports were themselves manipulated. Toppel is editing Manstein's private war diaries, with the first volume appearing in May of 2025. Scholarship on German military culture has moved alongside it. Sunk Neitzel's German Warriors, published in 2020, stands as the major recent synthesis, and Neitzel identifies something that fits this episode's argument precisely, which is an institutional inability to learn after 1942. Richard Overy called the book unavoidable for future study. And the question stays politically live through German military tradition policy, including the 2017 decree establishing that the Wehrmacht is not tradition forming for the Bundeswehr. Now the honest part, because an argument presenting only its own evidence is propaganda with footnotes. The strongest objection to everything said so far comes from the historian who did the most to build the economic case in the first place. Richard Overy wrote Why the Allies Won in 1995. And Overy's summary of his own thesis holds that the Allies won because they turned economic strength into effective fighting power, and turned the moral energies of their populations into an effective will to win. Note the structure of that sentence, where economic strength is the input and effective fighting power is the output, and the conversion between them is not automatic. Overy states the limits plainly, writing that there have been ample opportunities since 1945 to demonstrate that material superiority in war is not enough when the will to fight is lacking. Then Overy states the conclusion this episode has to accept, that the war stood poised on a knife edge in the middle years, and that the Allied victory in 1945 was not inevitable. That is the leading materialist historian of the war refusing to be a determinist. Overy's diagnosis of the German economy deserves stating in full, because it cuts sharper than any accusation of laziness or incompetence. The German economy, in Overy's assessment, fell between two stools, because it was not enough of a command economy to do what the Soviet system could do, and it was not capitalist enough to rely, as the United States did, on the recruitment of private enterprise. Germany got neither the coercive concentration of Soviet planning nor the mobilized initiative of American industry, and what Germany got instead was a hybrid that could do neither well. The second objection is chronological, and Mark Harrison supplies it himself. Harrison's periodization splits the war in two, holding that until the end of 1941 and into early 1942, military factors outweighed economic ones. Only from 1942 did economic fundamentals reassert themselves, and only then, in Harrison's phrasing, did economics ultimately determine the outcome. That concedes a great deal. Across the first 2.5 years of the war, the period containing the fall of France and the near destruction of the Soviet state, the economic argument is not the primary explanation, because something else was doing the work. Karl-Heinz Frieser identified what? Frieser's book The Blitzkrieg Legend, published in 1995 as the official German history of the 1940 campaign, argues that the German victory over France was not inevitable in any sense, and Frieser's campaign turns on contingency, on Allied mistakes, and on German local commanders exceeding or disobeying their orders. Frieser calls the operation a wild and desperate gamble that happened to succeed. A gamble that happened to succeed is the precise opposite of a structurally determined outcome. David Stahel makes a comparable argument about the following year. In Operation Barbarossa and Germany's defeat in the East, Stahel argues that the invasion of the Soviet Union was effectively doomed by the autumn of 1941, and Stahel locates the cause in operations and logistics rather than in aggregate economic capacity. That is a contingency argument as well, one that simply arrives at defeat instead of victory. The foundational debate underneath all of this remains open. Alan Milward argued in The German Economy at War, published in 1965, that Nazi Germany deliberately armed in breadth rather than in depth, building for short campaigns in order to protect civilian consumption, with a turning point in early 1942, and that is the Blitzkrieg economy thesis. Richard Overy countered that Blitzkrieg as an economic strategy never existed and got invented after the fact. Adam Tooze, who studied under Milward, partly restored his supervisor by confirming that Hitler did intend war in 1939, while demonstrating that the German economy sat more heavily mobilized early on than either Milward or Overy had calculated. Mark Harrison and Mark Roseman continued to accept elements of the original thesis. That argument is not resolved, and anyone telling you it is resolved is selling a simpler product than the evidence supports. So the fair verdict lands narrower than the one this episode opened with, and stronger for being narrower. Economic capacity did not automatically produce Allied victory, because economic capacity determined what was possible to sustain, and inside that envelope decisions, competence and will-decided outcomes. Germany's error was never that Germany got outproduced. Germany's error was forcing a decision inside an envelope that was closing. Assemble the pieces. Nazi Germany entered the war holding no oil, no rubber, no adequate iron ore, an army that moved on 750,000 horses, an industrial sector that could not standardize a truck chassis, and a leadership that understood its own material inferiority well enough to conclude that war had to happen quickly. Germany then acquired an empire and made that empire poorer. Germany imported 7.5 million people at gunpoint and worked a third of them to death in places like Mittelbau-Dora, where more people died building the V2 than the V2 ever killed. Germany concentrated 92% of its aviation fuel into 25 chemical plants and lost 97% of that fuel within 5 months once the combined bomber offensive found them. Germany built tanks it could not fuel, and during March of 1945 the Soviet army captured 1,200 of them standing still. Against all that, the opposing coalition assembled a 3.3-to-1 advantage in gross domestic product by 1944, launched 1,121 Liberty ships in a single year, shipped the Soviet Union more than half the rails it laid and over half the explosives it fired, and put 4 127,000 American trucks under a Red Army that had already outbuilt German armor 99,000 to 26,000, while its own coal output had fallen by two-thirds. Through all of it, the German war economy kept climbing, right up to the 1944 peak, right up to 39,807 aircraft in the year the roof came in. That is the shape of the thing. Nazi Germany was not defeated at a moment. Nazi Germany was defeated across a decade of accumulated structural choices, and then the moment simply arrived to collect. The reason this version of the story stays unfamiliar is that it offers no villains of the useful kind. It does not resolve into a bad decision made by one man on one afternoon. It resolves into coal allocation tables, freight car availability, hydrogenation plant capacity, and the position of a workforce on a learning curve. None of that films well, and all of it decided more than any battlefield. The generals who survived wrote the other version, the United States Army published it, and Albert Speer stood in front of a chart in June of 1944 and took credit for a curve that heavy industrial investment and Wright's law had already drawn for him. What remains once those stories are removed is an argument still running inside every ministry and every boardroom that has ever tried to reduce its dependence on a resource it does not control. Concentration is efficient until it turns fatal, standardization is boring until it wins, and controlling territory is not the same as being able to use it. Nazi Germany learned all three of those lessons. Nazi Germany learned them in the correct order and far too late, and the record of that education is written in 25 chemical plants, 1,200 abandoned tanks, and a production graph that was still rising on the day the arithmetic finally arrived.